Hello and welcome back to World Traveler Commentary. Today's post is basically about what is Christian democracy. Now, if you follow German politics, you will note that the primary parties in Germany that tend to the power seems to go back and forth between are the Social Democrats, and we've talked about social democracy, and the Christian Democrats. Also called the Christian Socialists, which is sort of the subject of today's discussion. Christian Democratic parties have historically been relatively powerful in Europe, though today not as much, partly because the end of the Cold War pushed Europe in an extremely neoliberal direction. And the centrist parties have been part of that. Consequently, they're relatively I want to say they've lost a lot of credibility as a result. So I want to talk instead about the historical basis of Christian democracy, what it is, and why this is perhaps, or why this has been one of the most influential responses to liberalism historically. Also, I think a lot of good has come out of the Christian democracy movements, but we'll talk about that in a moment. Now, the first thing you have to understand has to do with the history of social philosophy in the West. Social philosophy really begins with Plato. And Plato, it really gets going under Plato. You could argue that some of the pre-Socratic philosophers looked at these problems also, but Plato was the first one really to build his life's work around it. And if you look at Plato's work, most of it, in fact, centers around the question of what is justice, what is morality, what does it mean to be a moral person, how do we know what's moral? And of course, Plato focuses on the problems here, not so much on the solutions. Plato's successor, Aristotle, rather than focusing on problems, he takes a scholarly approach to it. So Aristotle's Politics is basically a survey of how, in his view, societies around him worked. It's a descriptive work. It's not really something that is fundamentally about starting with first principles and working from them. It's about starting with reality and trying to deduce first principles from that. An argument can be made that Aristotle was naive in some areas, particularly regarding gender relations in ancient Greece. I would point you to Chris Raum's excellent book, Ancient Greek Love Magic, for a interesting look at gender in ancient Greece in that regard. But the overall structure of Aristotle's Politics is something which has described sedentary societies relatively well for a long time. The idea that individuals come together to form procreative and economically productive households, and that these households then come together to form communities. This leads to common problems, and you end up with sort of the initial problems of governance arising from that. So Aristotle's Politics sets up a very bottom-up view of society, which is substantially, though not formally, a very democratic view, because the fundamental point of society is the shared flourishing of everybody, and basically the solutions have to come first from the households and in collaboration between households, rather than top-down from the state deciding things. This will become more interesting when we talk about sovereign democracy as another modern challenger to liberalism going forward, but that'll be another episode in the future. This became embedded in Catholic social tradition and was really deeply expounded by Thomas Aquinas. And so you have a set of social theories that develop within Catholic social teaching that's sometimes called Thomism, after Thomas Aquinas. And these basically go back to Aristotle's overall structure of society as he saw it in his day. So this line becomes important because when faced with the challenge of liberalism, the only real challenge to liberalism in Europe initially was what liberalism was replacing, which was Thomism. Now, liberalism gets its start in Hobbes, and I'm going to do another video here at some point which will discuss how liberalism is counterfactual. In other words, the factual mistakes that Hobbes makes, which leads liberals and consequently fascists and Marxist communists astray. That'll be another program, hope to air it soon. However, Hobbesian liberalism has a great appeal, primarily because it comes out of a certain brand of Calvinism, which is also tied to these strongly centralizing state processes which were happening in, particularly in Scotland. You have some aspects, particularly in Scotland. And it then becomes closely tied to the enclosure of the commons and the movement of everything towards private property instead of communal property, the rise of corporations, the development of a large economically disempowered class, which then could be exploited in the factories for profit. Now, as I say, that was liberalism. What it was replacing was Thomism, and so Christian democracy becomes something which arises out of an attempt to take Thomism into, the 19th century, and then later the 20th century. I argue right now that Christian democracy is largely dead, but it is something which I hope could be the basis for future movements. And there are, in fact, still some parts of the world which operate in a way which is clearly inspired by Christian democracy in important ways, and I would include Indonesia as one of those. So, Christian democracy comes out of the French Revolutionary times, actually, as an attempt to sort of improve the reach of Thomism within sort of liberal democratic political structures. So Christian Democrats don't reject liberal democracy's forms, but they reject the capitalist, or they originally rejected the capitalist goals, and they rejected the ideas of the centralized state. Now, going back to Thomism and going back to Aristotle, we see the argument that instead of the Hobbesian state, which is there to protect us from each other, and the Lockean state, which starts off as a Hobbesian state, but then adds this idea of we want to have ordered liberty as the outcome of a Thomistic state is shared flourishing for everybody. And the collaborative development of solutions to common problems. So I'm going to repeat that again. While the Hobbesians and Lockean, sort of the liberal state, starts off as the Hobbesian state there to protect us from each other and prevent the war of all against all, which Hobbes talks about, which is one of his factual mistakes. And extends towards this ideal of ordered liberty, brought up by Locke and others, which then extends towards, for example, property rights and things like that in a very capitalistic setting. The Thomistic view rejects the capitalism and it rejects the centralization of power in the state, and instead seeks to empower communities to build up, to solve their own problems, collaborating, say, between households, which should be the normal mode of production. So that's where you get the initial issue. From there, you have further development on in the Catholic social traditions, along with the fact that things then go pretty crazy in Germany in the mid 19th century. In the mid 19th century, the liberals take over Germany. They enact a large number of laws. These include taxation on churches, I believe, legalizing prostitution, mandatory education, bunches of things like this. This produces a lot of resistance, and it produces a lot of resistance in two parts of Germany. The first one is Bavaria, which is majority Catholic. Bavaria was within the furthest reach of the Roman Empire. It is an area which was, as I say, somewhat Romanized, and it became sort of the centerpiece, or the central point, the epicenter of the resistance against this massive liberalization of German society in the 1840s and 50s. Then you have Baden-Württemberg, which is predominantly Lutheran. Isn't nearly as Romanized, but they're still more Romanized than, say, northern Germany. And so these two parts of Germany effectively became the beginning point of the resistance. And Christian democracy in Germany started off as an anti-capitalist movement, something where the argument was that workers need a greater stake of ownership in what they make. Christian democracy started off organizing workers in agricultural areas and in other sectors, looking at ways of solving common problems. So you had a temperance movement. The temperance movement was built on excessive resistance to excessive drinking culture. So, unlike the United States, which has tended to have this extreme Hobbesian direction and, of course, banned alcohol, the Christian Democrats came up with a different solution, which was let's try to build more kinds of beverages so that people don't feel like they have to drink beer all the time. This was the foundation of what became German limonade culture. And in fact, if you go to Germany today, you'll see all kinds of limonades. These are lemon sodas with other fruit often involved. So Germany is the only place where you'll have lemon lemonade, and that is contrasted to orange lemonade and melon lemonade and apple lemonade and rhubarb lemonade and all these other lemon sodas with other things added. So that's one example. The Christian Democrats under the Zentrum Party eventually took power in the 1870s, and they rolled back a number of the liberal reforms. Interestingly enough, they did not roll back mandatory education, and they did not roll back the legalization of prostitution, primarily because public education is certainly a common good, and maybe it's not the role of the state to criminalize everything, right? What they did do is they rolled back a lot of the non-support for churches. They pushed in instead the beginnings of co-determination for coal and steel producers. And they worked with statesmen such as Bismarck on the development of the early German welfare system. So Germany's welfare system is built on Christian democratic lines, and therefore things like medical insurance are usually typically formally outside the state. I mean, taxes are collected by the state, they're given to these self-managing funds which are not under the oversight of the state directly or not directly managed by the state, but they are regulated by the state. And there are some other requirements which are, you could say maybe guided by the state, but not, but only sort of on the edges. There's still like room for different Krankenkassen to have different policies and different priorities and things like that. Another good example of Christian democratic policy in Germany and how it differs from, say, in Sweden, the social democratic structures in Sweden, is that, like in Sweden, when you talk about drinking age limits, it's a question of people coming together and deciding what the drinking age should be, and then trying to set this up in a way that discourages alcohol consumption. So in Sweden, if you want to buy any alcoholic beverage with alcoholic content of more than 3.5% alcohol by volume, you have to buy it at Systembolaget, the system company, and that's basically a state-owned liquor monopoly. Anything from regular beer through spirits can only be bought there. You have to be 21 to buy. If you want to buy a beer that's up to 2.25%, no drinking age on that, although establishments are free to set their own. And between 2.25 and 5% is drinking. The purchase age is 18 and can be purchased at the grocery store. But that's the approach that the Social Democrats took in Sweden. In Germany, the approach, instead of we're going to regulate alcohol usage and try to set up state policies to discourage it, the approach was instead we want to try to empower people to avoid harms from overconsumption of alcohol. And so in Germany, children as young as 14 may drink beer or wine in a restaurant with the supervision of a parent. Typically, there's not going to be a lot of concerns over like younger kids being given a sip, but if somebody's actually getting an order of it, it has to be 14. 16 to buy beer or wine, 18 to buy spirits. So you have this phased limit coming in, and it focuses on trying to make sure that you start with parental supervision of drinking beer or wine in, for example, a meal setting. And starting there and then, giving people more freedom after that. So that's the German approach, and I think it's a good approach. You do see, you see different failure cases in both. I think you do see some cases more drunkenness in Germany, but you see a lot more binge drinking in Sweden, for example. That's my, so that's a basic view on this. So what you get out of the old school Christian democratic movements is a strong skepticism of capitalism and sort of the separation of ownership and labor in business. You see efforts at trying to align those together. You see the idea that policy should be collaboratively developed on a local level first, and that the role of the state should be more along the lines of aligning everybody's interests and less the policeman there with the club that's going to beat you for, selling cigarettes illegally or whatever. The end result was, a really thriving approach to society, for example, within West Germany during the Cold War. Problem why these have disappeared, in my view, is largely that with the end of the Cold War, both the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats liberalized, and despite the fact that that Christian democracy is an older and more radical departure from liberalism, liberalizing the basic assumptions of what the state should do and shouldn't do and this sort of thing, has led to a more thoroughly liberal party. So in Germany, for example, the great waves of privatization were under Helmut Kohl, who was a Christian Democrat, and Gerhard Schroeder, who was a Social Democrat. But the Kohl privatizations were probably larger and deeper. And even, under the Merkel government, the emphasis on, say, question of refugees, inclusion, was very, very much driven by how do we bring workers in for profit, much more than it was how do we help people. During the COVID situation, one of the things that caused a lot of problems for the Christian Democrats was that there were corruption scandals, people accepting millions of euros in bribes for things like mask policies. And you can't have a Christian democratic movement which is heavily liberalized. It's not going to work very well. It will end up becoming nothing but an extreme liberal movement. It's hard to see a big difference between the FPD, which is sort of the liberal party in Germany, and the Christian Democrats at this point. There were efforts to try to revive Christian democracy. Viktor Orban in Hungary is trying to do something in that regard. The difficulty there is that while it has a lot of the outward trappings of Christian democracy, you don't have the rejection of the Hobbesian state. And if you don't have this rejection of the Hobbesian state, then you have something which is not going to go in a good direction. When people call Orban a fascist, you can see some similarity there, particularly because of the Hobbesian nature of the Hungarian state. There's the effort of trying to build a Christian Democratic Party in the US, the American Solidarity Party. The tension there is always between, how far liberals should take the party. And the difficulty is that if you don't liberalize the party, how are you going to reach out to thoroughly liberalized American voters? On the other hand, if you liberalize the party, what do you really offer, right? So, in my view, Christian democracy looks like it's dead in the West. I don't necessarily think I don't think it'll necessarily stay that. but now is not its moment. I certainly hope that there are times when it may be possible to bring these movements back, because in fact we do need a state-skeptical anti-capitalist movement to deal with a lot of the problems that we're going to be facing going forward. So that's what I have on this today. I'll talk to you another time. Have a great day.